Welcome to Discovering the Ancient Paths. I am Pastor Mark Biltz of El Shaddai Ministries. We meet every Saturday morning in Tacoma, Washington from 10 a.m. to 12:30. One of the most exciting things we do is to look at the New Testament through the lens of the culture during the very days of the Messiah. We also go through the Torah, or the first 5 books of Moses, throughout the entire year, dividing it into 52 sections, so over the year, all 5 books are covered. Remember after the resurrection, on the road to Emmaus, how the disciples' hearts were burning as Jesus opened up the Old Testament to them in ways they had never seen. That's what we do every week. Join us on the journey of your life right here at El Shaddai Ministries, meeting every Saturday morning right here in Tacoma, Washington from 10 a.m. to 12:30. We'll see you there. I have on the screen here Metzora, the leper, and you can see going from right to left. Let me bring this up so I can point out. This is the M, the TZ, the R, and the AH, Metzora. You see it going that direction. And then here is Tazria. She conceives. This is the letter T, Z, R, and then kind of the Yah, Tazria. She conceives. So what's amazing about that is last week's Torah portion, as I said, is tied to this week's. And so how many of you know whenever we study the Torah portion, what are we supposed to be looking for? Yeah, or who are we supposed to be looking for? Yeshua, the Messiah. Remember on the road to Emmaus, as the disciples were walking, it says Yeshua was walking along with them, and he opened up the scriptures, and they saw it was all about him. Remember that? So whenever we're reading the Torah, we need to look at it in the light of what is this telling us about Messiah. Don't look at it as just a history book. Don't look at it as a scientific book. You know, of course you can. All of those are good. But as you know, there's many levels when you read the Bible. And so you have to decide what level are you going to look at it. Well, one of my favorites is looking at it, where can we find the Messiah in this Torah portion? Well, let's look at the opening verse again from last week's Torah portion before we jump in to see the tie-in. Leviticus 12, 1 and 2. It says, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, if a woman be delivered or conceive seed and bear a man-child, then shall she be unclean how many days? Okay, as in the days of the impurity of her sickness, shall she be unclean. Okay, so she talks about bearing seed. Okay, so as a matter of fact, if you look at Tazria, she conceives. Do you remember every Hebrew word is built upon other 2 or 3 Hebrew letters that also can have words within it? And look at this. Here it talks about when she conceives seed and she bears a man-child. Well, in that word is the word for seed. And the very word to conceive, you have the Hebrew word, the zayin resh ayin, which means seed. And so in Revelation 12:5, we talk about she was delivered of a son, a man-child. Here we have the same concept of a man-child in the Torah and a man-child in Revelation. Okay, and he is going to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Okay, well, we're going to look at this at several different levels. And so let me explain this. How many of you know God, the Lord, is our brother? Right? He's also our father. Okay? He's also to be our friend. Okay, so there's a lot of different titles. And even Israel is considered God's son. Israel's also considered his bride. Okay, so you can have all these different relationships. It's not like one relationship is right and another one is wrong. God is trying to show us all the different ways he relates to us, okay? Well, get a load of this. How many of you know Adam and Eve were the bride and the groom, right? The first bride and the first groom. Well, when the bride gives birth, she's unclean how many days? And a day with the Lord is 1,000 years. So 7,000 years, mankind's been unclean. Okay? And Israel also, being the bride, is unclean 7 days. Okay? And look at this. Here is the phrase in Hebrew where you see that, no, I didn't put the English above it, but it's a woman. The first word is a woman who, Tazria, conceives seed, and then you have the word yeled, the root word, zakar, or a man-child. So this is the very phrase in Hebrew about a woman who conceives a man-child. Okay? Does everyone understand that? Well, what's interesting, remember, it's always about the Messiah, right? And I just showed you here it's about a man-child in Leviticus. We hear about a man-child in Revelation. And how many of us know from last week, Messiah is the son, is the leper scholar? Okay, and here this whole Torah portion is about leprosy. And so we're learning about the leper scholar. And get a load of this. The numerical value, if you were to add up the numerical value of this phrase, it's 434. Did you know 434 is a very important number in Israel? Okay, does anyone know why 358 is important? 358? That's the word Mashiach, for the Messiah. Okay? Well, this phrase, 434, is very significant. Well, let me bring this up so I can show you. Right there is the word. The first one is, okay, this is what sound? Am. What's this? She. And what's this? Mashiach. Right there is Mashiach. You'll know the mem is 40. Okay. The shin is 300. The yud is 10, 8. You get 358. Do you see that? 340, 10, and 8 is 358. So that's the Mashiach is very important. Well, 434 is, what's this letter? The B, and the final noon, Ben. David, Mashiach ben David is also 434. Now, some people that know Hebrew say, well, wait, there's the extra yud in there. Well, the extra yud is in there for a specific reason, and it also has to do with the 9 songs that have been sung, and Messiah himself sings the 10th song, which has to do with yud, the letter 10, but there's other things. But when the Jew sees the text, Mashiach ben David is 434, and they see the phrase about this woman who conceives seed and bears a man-child. They're saying this is about the Messiah. You following me? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, here is the other thing. The 8th day, the child is circumcised and given a name, right? That's when their name is given, on the 8th day. Well, what I think is interesting is on the 8th day, the 8,000th year after the millennial reign, what do we find? We receive a new name, and the Messiah receives a new name. Look at Revelation 2:17. He that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him that overcomes, to him will I give the hidden manna. I will give him a white stone, and upon the stone a new name written, which no one knows but he that receives it. So here, in one sense, humanity, all of us were in Adam and Eve, and so we, in one sense, were created, and at the end of the 8,000th year, or at the beginning of the 8,000th year, that 8th day, we are going to receive our name. And Messiah receives a new name. Yeah, and then, look at this. Look at Revelation 3:12 and 13. He that overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. He'll go out of there no more. I will write upon him the name of my God, the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and my own new name. He that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. That you receive your name on the 8th day. And think of the 7,000-year plan of God, and at the end, when the new heavens, new earth, 8 is all about new beginnings. Everyone gets the new name. This was the whole concept in seed form of circumcision on the 8th day, because at the 8th day, we will also have the fleshly desires torn off, and we will all be given a new name as well as the Messiah. Now, to think we can see all that in Leviticus. Okay. As a matter of fact, there was a promise in the Garden of Eden. God says, I'm going to put enmity between you, serpent, and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. It'll bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel. And that seed is who? The Messiah. And so as we're reading Tazria, Metzora, about the leper Messiah, he is that promised seed that's being talked about here. As a matter of fact, everyone here is very familiar with John chapter 12, verse 24, where Yeshua says, verily, verily, I say to you, except a grain or a kernel of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abides alone. But if it does, what happens? It becomes a tree and it bears much fruit. That's what happens when the seed dies. And this is why Messiah had to die, so that he could end up bearing much fruit. Now, the Torah portion that we're reading is all about, really, the Galua, or the redemption process. So we have, whenever we read Torah, look for the redemption process, look for the Messiah. And here, mankind has introduced the death process, and Messiah, as a seed, is being planted into the earth. Then he's born, and then it talks about his death, and will cause the tree to continue to grow and produce fruit until the redemption occurs. And then again, we have the birth pangs of the Messiah. But let's look at Mark, Gospel of Mark for a minute, chapter 4, and look at verse 30 through 32. And he said, with what can we compare the kingdom of God, or what parable shall we use for it? He said, it is like a grain of what? Okay, so the very concept of a seed is likened to the kingdom of God. When it is sown on the ground, it is the smallest of all of the seeds on the earth, yet when it is sown, it grows up and becomes larger than all of the garden plants and puts out these large branches so the birds of the air can make nests in its shade. And so again, it's just a little small seed can produce a big tree with much fruit. And I believe we're going to look at that more next week. But last week, we talked about how the Messiah is the leper scholar. And we saw how Yeshua healed many lepers, okay? And by touching them, he took on their leprosy, and he became unclean. Well, Messiah also took upon himself all of our diseases. And we saw how the Messiah, from Isaiah 53, if you remember, was stricken or smitten, and the Hebrew word was representing the plague of leprosy. If you remember, we had the word plague is negah, and the word for to be smitten or struck is also the same root word. And what did we find out was the reason why people were plagued with leprosy? Evil speech. And one guy said, maybe that's where we got negativity from. Isn't that? I thought, well, that's very fascinating. But the other thing that I thought was interesting was, I don't know if you knew this, but negah, when you move the last letter to the first place, you get oneg, which means a delight. And so it's fascinating that we can be negative, have negative thoughts of the Torah, or by simply putting things in the right order, we can be a delight. And God says, if you consider my Sabbath a delight, you will ride on the high places of the earth. So we can either be negative and have a plague of negah by our evil speech toward God's word, or we can treat it like a delight and be blessed. It is truly our choice. But now, here's the thing. The leper, he was cast where? Outside of the camp, outside of the community of Israel. Well, guess what? Yeshua, as that promised seed, who is the leper scholar, who took on our leprosy, he also has been kicked out of the community of Israel for the last 2,000 years. He's been banned for the last 2,000 years. Okay? Now, Last week, we spoke of his birth and death, and today of his cleansing and the redemption process for the house of Israel and the believers. Because what are we going to find out in a little bit? A house can also be contaminated with leprosy by their evil speech. And guess what? Israel, the house, was contaminated with leprosy by their evil speech. They even see the temple was destroyed because of evil speech. And so not only the physical house had leprosy, the whole house of Israel had leprosy in their house because of their evil speech. But let's look at this. Leviticus 14, 1 through 7, it talks about how the Lord spoke to Moses saying, this is the law of the leper in the day of his cleansing. He is to be brought to the priest. Okay, everyone say that? See that? He shall be what? But guess what? Where is the priest? Well, let's look. The priest has to go where? Because where's the leper? Out of the camp. So the priest has to go out of the camp to meet the leper. Okay, so now if you're the priest and you got to go out of the camp to meet the leper, and you got to check to see if he's healed, you're going to become unclean. Well, not only that, it talks about someone bringing the leper. What happens to the guy who brings the leper? Is it another leper that brings the leper? Because that's who's out of the camp. It can only be another leper who brings the leper. And then the priest has to go out of the camp and be faced with the possibility of being contaminated. All right? That's all very interesting. And then it says the priest examines him, and if the plague of leprosy is what? So he doesn't even know when he goes out if he's healed yet until he examines him. And then if it is healed, then the priest will command them to take for him who is to be cleansed. He hasn't been cleansed yet. And we read what we read last week about the 2 clean birds, the cedar wood, the scarlet, and the hyssop. Okay, so we're going to take a look here for a minute at house leprosy. Now, this is how you know this is not, I think it's called Hansen's disease or the leprosy of today. This had nothing to do with the leprosy of today, the leprosy of the Bible, because a house gets leprosy. A garment can get leprosy. Maybe that's why God says we have to change our garments. Maybe, can you imagine, he says, I just remembered that one parable, and I think we'll talk about this more next week, but someone invites someone to a wedding, and he comes in the wrong garment, right? Maybe it had leprosy. And this is why we need to realize we have to have on the right garments. Okay, but anyway, Leviticus 14, 33 through 40. Now, when did Israel as a nation commit Lashon hara against God or evil speech? I believe it was when they said, he only brought us out to kill us. Leprosy is brought on by evil speech, and here they spoke evil against the land God had promised to give them. They speak evil against God, saying, you just brought us out to kill us. Okay, and so Israel as a house, the house of Israel, you got the house of Judah. Before they were one house, the house of Israel. And I believe that house has been contaminated with leprosy because of their evil speech. And it could be for the last 2,000 years for their evil speech against Yeshua. But the time is coming for their cleansing. All right, so let's look at Leviticus 14, verses 33 through 40. The Lord speaks to Moses. And he says unto Aaron, saying, when you come into the land of Canaan, which I give to you for a possession, and I put the plague of leprosy in a house. Okay, how does it get there? God puts it there. And again, that word for plague is negah. He says, he that owns the house has to come and tell the priest, and look at his words. It seems to me there is, as it were, a plague, negah, in the house. Now notice it just said God put the plague in the house. The owner knows it's the plague, but the owner is not allowed to go to the priest and say, God put the plague in my house. I know the plague is in my house. You come and you take a look at it. No, he can't say that. He has to say, it seems to me. In other words, you can't be a know-it-all. Sometimes we find that's where the plague of leprosy from evil speech begins, is we think more highly of ourselves than we ought to think. And so it says he's to say, it seems to me as it were, a plague. And then the priest shall command that they do what? Empty the house before the priest even goes in to see if it is in the plague, that all that is in it will not be made unclean or spiritually defiled. And afterward, the priest shall go in to see the house. So here's what is so strange about this plague of leprosy. God definitely puts leprosy in the house, so we know it's leprosy. But it is not leprosy until the priest goes in and declares it to be leprosy. And everything that is in your house doesn't have leprosy if you bring it out, even though it had leprosy. If you bring it out, if you leave it in and the priest says it, then everything in your house becomes leprous. But if you follow directions and do what the priest says and taking it out first before he goes in, then you don't have that problem. But also the problem is, we'll get into this a little bit, but it's just so humorous, I have to say it. How many of you want everyone to see what's in your house? You know, especially if you lie and say, so let's say you borrowed someone's shovel. And then all of a sudden, he asks for it. And you say, I don't have it. I don't know where it is. And then your house gets leprosy. And now you have to bring everything out of the house. And here comes his shovel. Liar, liar. Okay. And so one of the concepts is we need to learn to be generous and not greedy and stingy. And if people, maybe someone just wants to borrow a pot or a pan. Oh, I don't have that. And then all of a sudden, God smites the house with leprosy, and you got to bring out all your pots and pans. Okay, so there's a whole different concept of this house leprosy that I want you to kind of think of at a whole nother level, why God is doing this. And then he looks on the plague, and behold, if the plague is in the walls of the house, with hollow strakes, greenish and reddish, which is inside or lower than the wall, then the priest will go out of the house to the door of the house, and he shuts up the house for how many days? And the priest will come again the seventh day and shall look. And I can't help but think of the 7,000th year, Messiah is going to come to this earth, this house, and he's going to examine it. And it says, behold, if the plague is spread in the walls of the house, then the priest will command that they take away the stones in which the plague is, and they cast them into an unclean place without the city. So let's say you have an all-stone house. You take everything out of the house, and there's maybe 4 or 5 stones that have the plague of your inner walls. You have to take those specific stones out and put them in an unclean place, and you have to put in what? New stones. All right? Well, get a load of this. The stones are thrown down, right? Well, what happens? The temple, Israel, was broken down, and it needed to be cleansed. The stones, every stone, it was completely leprous. And Yeshua says every stone is what? Going down. It's leprous. The house, it represents the house. Look at Leviticus 14:42. Then they shall take what? Other stones and put them in the place of those stones. Well, look at 1 Peter 2:4 and 5. As you come to him, you are a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious. You yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Yeshua HaMashiach. Just like the broken branches and the wild branches, there are stones that have been broken down because of evil speech, and now you as living stones are being grafted into that house of Israel. We can learn numerous lessons from the statement of the owner of a house also that appears to be afflicted with this spiritual defilement. Okay, we see at first this house is affected. And then comes his clothing, and only after these manifestations is his body afflicted. So sa'arat, or leprosy, can also be a good pain. How many of you know it hurts? I mean, you have pain, but it's a good pain. You know, because you know it's, I mean, some pain is bad pain, but other pain, you know it's pain, but you know it's for your good, right? Pain can't be good. Well, they say that punishing him at a stage when all of the faults can still be rectified, and they may even be rewarded. So even though leprosy comes from evil speech, maybe there's a lot of evil speech going on in the house, And in the room where the evil speech goes on is where the stones get affected. Okay? But we need to realize sometimes God spanks us, but how many of you know it's for our good? I don't know how many of you remember Rashi, our new Rashi. He lived about 1,000 years ago. And he said that even if the owner of the house, see, if you remember, the Canaanites were cast out and they're put in. So maybe the house has leprosy from what the Canaanites were saying in the land, as what they were doing. So it's not just the owner of the house. It could be the new owner. How many of you ever bought a house and the house had problems from the previous owners? Okay, so this is the deal in the promised land. The Canaanites go out, the Israelites come in, and now all of a sudden they have leprosy in their house. It may not have been because of them. It could have been from the previous owners. But how many of you know, how many of you like moving? Can you imagine having to move everything out of your house and you're not moving, you're just going to put it back in again? Okay, well, but sometimes God just says this pain, what a pain in the neck that I got to move all this stuff out. It's not even my fault, it's the previous owner's fault. But guess what they say happened historically? Historically, the Canaanites would hide their wealth in the walls and put these stones up. And God would cause the plague specifically on the stones that if they were removed, they would find the buried treasure. Isn't it amazing how God works? We think this is such a pain, and then we find out, oh my goodness, there's wealth behind this pain, behind these walls. So again, there's a negative and a positive to all these things, but we need to look at the positive. Now, what's interesting is the owner of the house can't say with certainty that it is the plague. He has to say kanega, and by adding that letter K or the kaf in Hebrew, it means like the plague. He can only say it's like the plague because only the priest has the authority to say it is the plague. So basically, there's some things we could learn from this. First, that the Torah is teaching us a lesson in proper behavior. We need to learn to speak with reservation and humility even when the situation looks unequivocally clear. So in other words, we have to teach our tongue to say, I'm not sure. And especially when it comes to the prophetic. I mean, there's so many people, instead of prophetic, it's pathetic. I mean, thus saith the Lord, this is going to happen. No. I mean, first off, the Bible says, you better be real careful because you're going to be held accountable. But the other thing is, I like to prefer to say, this is kind of what I think maybe might happen, let's watch for. So we need to teach our tongue to say that we don't always know everything. Secondly, since the priest is the only one who can determine whether or not the plague is unclean, for anyone else to say that, it would be disrespectful towards the position of the priest. Thirdly, the owner cannot say the plague simply because it's not true. It's fake news until the priest says it. So we need to say until the priest proclaims it, it's not a plague. And it can't be spoken as being that way. How often do we speak about other people sometimes and we don't know all the facts either? And then finally, when the symptoms of leprosy appear in the house, and it is a plague, but it does not attain the status until the priest declares it. Meanwhile, however, it is still possible that the plague may go away. He waits for a week to see. Even then. And then the Kohen will proclaim either clean or unclean. And so basically the owner of the house is, for this next week, shut up. Don't open your mouth to the adversary. Don't speak worst case scenarios. And I see that a lot of times. And, I don't want to get anybody upset or anything. But it's like some people will say, I have some disease, before they even seen the doctor. Before they even see the doctor and have it say, yes, you have it. I mean, they'll just go around confessing to everyone they have this problem, but they're not the ones that make the final decision. It's going to be the doctor, and you can always pray to God and he can remove it, whatever. But all too often, people like to come across as they're the authority in something, and they don't really have that authority. Okay, So God is doing the owner of the house a favor by making him aware of a fault in his character. It could be a fault of a person that's in the house, but this seemingly plague is actually an alarm bell or a wake-up call to repentance. Okay, so it's not time to have a negative attitude, but we need to have a positive attitude. And so they say also what we learned from this is we need to pursue truth with humility. We need to respect those in positions of honor. We need to not make hasteful decisions. We need to be accurate. We always need to be open to positive results and be ready for anything for self-improvement. And we have to be careful with every word that we speak. So there's a lot that we can learn just from this Torah portion on leprosy in the house. Now, here's the thing about, the three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In Judaism, it is a religion more of the ear than the eye. In Christianity, it's more of the eye. In Judaism, it's more the ear, okay? It's hearing the words rather than seeing the images. God created the natural world with what? Words. And we need to be listening for those words. And with words, we can create or damage the world that we live in, especially social media, as they say things. So what do you think is the opposite of negative speech? Positive speech, exactly. Instead of Lashon Hara, it's Lashon HaTov, the good tongue. Encouraging speech, positive speech. One of the interesting things, I don't know how many of you have heard of Maimonides, but he also was about 1,000 years ago, and he said, to speak in praise of people is part of the command to love your neighbor as yourself. We need to learn to love our neighbor by speaking good about our neighbor. Now, let me see how much time I have. I got a little bit of time yet. Wow, okay. Let me see where I'm at. All right. I kind of covered this, so let me go over here. So let's take a moment and look at the Haftorah. All right, this is the Torah or the part of the writings that go with the Torah portion. Let's go to 2 Kings chapter 7, verse 3 through 5. Here there are 4 lepers, and they're at the entering in of the gate. And they said one to another, why are we just going to sit here until we die? Because, see, they can't go in, right? They have to be outside of the gate. And they say, if we will enter into the city, well, the famine is in the city, and we're going to die there. And if we sit here, we're also going to die. So they said, okay, let's go fall to the host of the Syrians who are ready to destroy the camp. And if they save us alive, then we'll live. And if they kill us, we'll only die. And so they rose up in the twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. And when they were come to the uttermost part of the camp of Syria, behold, what? Everybody fled. There wasn't anybody there. Okay, so now what are they going to do? Gee, we're lepers. We're not supposed to go into the city. Do we go into the city anyway and tell everybody? What do we do? And it says in verse 8 and 9, and when these lepers came to the uttermost part of the camp, they went into one tent, and they ate and drank and carried their silver and gold and raiment and went and hid it. And then they came again and entered into another tent and did the same thing and went and hid it. And then they said one to another, this is not good. This is a day of good tidings. And if we hold our peace, if we tarry till the morning light, mischief will come upon us. Now, therefore, come that we may go and tell the king's household. So here these 4 lepers are going to go ahead and go into the city, right to the king's house, to tell him that they don't need to worry. The battle was the Lord's. And I think that's one of the things that we need to always realize is the Bible says the battle is the Lord's. But it also said the victory is ours. How many of you want the Lord to go to battle for you? Yay! Leviticus. Chapter 12, starting in verse 1, and we're going to look through chapter 13, verse 59. We've got the Haftorah portion of Ezekiel. And the Torah portion, as you know, is Tazria, which means she conceives. And we see that in the first verse where it says, the Lord speaks to Moses, and he said, Speak to the children of Israel and say, if a woman conceives and bears a male child, she's unclean for 7 days. As in the days of her monthly period, she shall be unclean. In the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. And then it talks how she continues to be unclean. And then it talks about for if she bears a girl, then she's unclean longer. And some people think, well, that's not fair. Well, actually, that's honoring women, believe it or not, more so than the boys. You can listen to one of the past lessons to understand that. But let's jump to Leviticus 13. I want to focus on the plague of leprosy a little bit more this morning. And here it says how the Lord spoke to both Moses and Aaron. And he said, when a man shall have a rising in his skin or a scab or a bright spot, and it becomes in the skin of his body the plague. And the Hebrew word for plague there, I think, is on your notes. It's negah. That's the nun, gimel, ayin. And it's called the plague of sa'arat, or leprosy. And then it says, okay, if he's got the plague of leprosy, he's to be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons, the other priest. And what is the priest supposed to do? Examine the plague in the skin, and if the hair in the plague has turned white, and the appearance of the plague is deeper than the body's skin, it is the plague of leprosy. And the priest shall examine him and pronounce him unclean. Notice twice it said the priest shall examine him. That's very important concerning this plague. Well, that Hebrew word negah for the plague has several different layers of meaning. One of them is to receive a blow, to be stricken, to receive stripes, a stroke, a wound, which is why in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 4, it says, surely he has borne our sickness, carried our suffering, yet we considered him negah. We considered him plagued or struck by God and afflicted. So just like a plague can imply being received blows, what do we find? That same Hebrew word is used in Isaiah 53 concerning the Messiah who's going to be receiving strikes and blows. This is why in the Babylonian Talmud, it says they were questioning, what is going to be the Messiah's name? And the rabbi said, well, he is going to be the leper scholar. He's going to know all about leprosy. Because it says, and they quote Isaiah 53, surely he's borne our griefs, carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him a leper, they say, smitten of God and afflicted. And so this word here can refer to being stricken as with a disease, yet they need not be understood necessarily in only that way, like our English word stricken can refer to stricken with a disease also, or simply stricken with a fist as well. Either way, we know Yeshua received strokes, okay? He was certainly stricken with a Roman whip, and he was also stricken with a fist, and he was also stricken with a reed. We see in John 19:1. So Pilate then took Yeshua, and what did they do? He flogged him. Okay? And then look at John 19:3. And they said, "Hail, King of the Jews." And what did they do? They hit him with their fists. And then look at Luke 22:63 and 64. The men who held Yeshua mocked him and beat him. Having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face. And they asked him, "Prophesy, who was the one who struck you?" So isn't that fascinating that Messiah is known as the leper scholar? He's the one that will be plagued, or negah, smitten. And he was smitten in so many different ways. Look at Matthew 27:30. They spit on him, and they took the reed, and they smote him on the head. So as a leper was despised and rejected, they were cast out of the camp. So also was the Messiah despised, rejected, and slain outside of the camp. So I find it interesting that he is one of the names that they say of the Messiah will be the leper scholar. Now, here's what's interesting. This is in ancient Jewish literature. It is said that in the Garden of Eden, there is a palace called the Palace of the Sons of Sickness. This palace, the Messiah enters and he summons every sickness, every pain, every chastisement, and they all come and rest upon him. Isn't that incredible? And what did the Messiah do? He took all of our pain, all of our sicknesses, and everything upon himself. But what I think is so important is this phrase, the priest shall examine him. That's a command. He shall. Well, look at this. How many of you know if God says something once, it's important? If he says something twice, it's really important. What if he says it 3 or 4 times? You better get a load of this. In Leviticus 13:5, the priest shall examine him on the 7th day. Verse 6, the priest shall examine him again on the 7th day. Verse 8, the priest shall examine him. Verse 9 and 10, when the plague of leprosy is in the man, he shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall do what? Examine him. Verse 12 and 13, if the leprosy breaks out all over and covers all the skin of the infected person from head to toe, as far as it appears to the priest, then the priest shall do what? Examine him. Verse 15, the priest shall examine the raw flesh. Verse 17, the priest shall examine him. Verse 20, and the priest shall examine it. 21, the priest shall examine it. 26, the priest examines it. 27, the priest examines him. Verse 30, the priest shall examine him. Do you know what goes on in verse 31, 32, 34, 36, 39, 43, 50, 53, 55? So, do you think the priest ought to examine him? I think if I was a priest and I read that chapter, I'd say, okay, I think God wants me to examine it. All right. So the important thing is they have to, why do you think God puts just the emphasis on the priest examining him? It's pretty important. Well, now, with that in mind, let's go to Matthew chapter 8. And let's look at verse 2 through 4. Behold, a leper comes to Yeshua and worship him, saying, Lord, if you want, you can make me what? But here's what's important. He did not say, you can heal me. There's a big difference between being healed and being cleansed. So let's keep going. It says, Yeshua stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I want to be made what? And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Yeshua said to him, see that you don't tell anybody, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. So in other words, Yeshua didn't say, okay, the Torah's all done away with. You don't need to go to the priest to examine it because I'm greater than the priest and it's all taken care of. No. Yeshua said, you now have to go back according to the Torah, have the priest examine you. Okay? Now let's look at Numbers 12:10. Here we see the cloud departed from over the tent of Moses' tabernacle. And it says, and behold, Miriam was what? As white as snow. When Aaron looked at Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. Okay, let me ask you this. Who else had leprosy in the Torah beside Miriam? Moses. Remember, he pulled out his hand and it became leprous, and then he put it back and it went away. What did Miriam do that caused her leprosy? She was bad-mouthing Moses, who he married. And so look at Psalms 64:3. It says, these people who whet their tongue like a sword and bend their bows to shoot their arrows, even bitter words. So it was based on what Miriam said. And so what they say is what causes biblical leprosy, which is not the modern leprosy we think of today, because even homes and clothes can get the leprosy, biblical leprosy. But they say that it's lashon hara, or the evil speech, that brings on biblical leprosy. And they say one of the reasons is because, let me just see where I'm at. Let me show you something. Let me go here first. Okay, you have the word leper. If you take those first two letters and separate them from the last two letters, you literally get the word evil speech. So the very word leper, when cut in half, is like a compound word that means evil speech. So this is why they say our words can be like arrows. When you think about it, you can stand in one place and your words can wreak havoc on another who is very far away. Sometimes they're deflected from the object of their venom and they strike innocent bystanders. Our words can often strike innocent bystanders who we're whining and complaining to. Hateful words can lead to hateful actions. Our thoughts often find expression in spoken words, and spoken words seek realization through deeds. Every word that we utter is real. I want you to think of that. Think when you speak words, you're throwing physical objects out. It's a real word. When God said, "Let there be light," what happened? There was light. Our words can bring forth reality, and they can even have an impact when it's not seen in the physical world. We may not be able to see the physical impact of this brick we're throwing out of our mouth, but we have to realize that lashon hara is a weapon that's manufactured completely from words. Yet the Torah considers the harm those words create to be massive. So now what we're going to look at is the fact that you can only be cleansed after you are healed. That's important. So let's look at the leper recipe book. Let's pull it out. Look at this in Leviticus. This is chapter 14. I'm going to go at verse 1 through 7. The Lord tells Moses, "This is the law of the leper in the day of his" what? Cleansing. He's to be brought to the priest, and the priest is to go where? Why? Because the leper can't come in. And then what is the priest supposed to do? Imagine that. "And behold, if the plague of leprosy is" what? Healed. If the plague of leprosy is healed in the leper, then the priest shall command them to take for him who is to be cleansed. Okay, so first comes healing. He can't come into the camp until he's healed. So the priest goes outside of the camp, looks at him and says, "Yep, you're healed. Okay, now that we know you're healed, you can go get cleansed." All right? Now, how does the cleansing take place? Now, realize this recipe for cleansing is not the recipe for healing. Okay? And it says here, they're to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 living clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet, and hyssop. And the priest will command them to kill one of the birds, and it has to be in an earthen vessel over running water. As for the living bird, what does he do? He takes it, and the cedar wood, and the scarlet, and the hyssop, and he ties this poor bird to this stick. Okay, and then he takes the living bird and he dips them and the living bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the running water. And then he shall sprinkle on him who is to be cleansed from the leprosy 7 times and pronounce him clean. And shall let the living bird go to the open field. Can you imagine that bird after being all tied up, dunked in water, shaken all around, and then you untie him, he goes, "I'm out of here," you know. And it says he that's to be cleansed then has to wash his clothes, shave off all of their hair, and then wash himself. Man, he has to wash his clothes, shave off his hair, wash himself that he may be clean. And after that, he can come into the camp and shall tarry abroad out of his tent 7 days. Now, this is a lot of ritual that has to be done. And then, so we see the priest goes out to the leper, and we have to realize that these rituals are not the cure for the treatment, but cleansing from the state of uncleanness after the healing takes place. So now let's look at the Gospels again in Mark chapter 1, and let's look at verse 40 and 45. Now a leper comes to him, begging him, kneeling down to him. You know what's fascinating? This tells me that Jesus had to be outside the camp because a leper can't come in the camp. Okay, so Yeshua's outside the camp. This guy comes down, and he says, if you want to, you can make me clean. In other words, he's saying, I don't want to just be healed. He says, I want the whole process. I want to be healed, and I want to be cleansed. And so it says, Yeshua, being moved with compassion, he stretched out his hand, and what did he do? Oh my goodness. Yeshua was just negah, or struck. He took on his infirmity. He became unclean, Yeshua did, by touching the only thing that was more contaminating than leprosy was a corpse. But Yeshua wasn't afraid, and he reached out and touched him. And he said, you bet I want to. Be made clean. And when he said this, immediately the leprosy departed from him, and he was made clean. And he strictly warned him and immediately sent him out. And he said to him, don't say anything to anybody, but go show yourself to the priest and offer your cleansing, the things which Moses commanded, for a testimony to them. So even though he was cleansed, Yeshua was still honoring the Torah, saying, now you need to go and have the priest examine you. But what did this guy do? He went out and he began to proclaim it much, and he spread it about the whole matter, so Yeshua could no more openly enter into the city, but was outside in desert places, and they came to him from everywhere. You know what's amazing? What is leprosy caused by? Open it by saying things you're not supposed to. And Yeshua tells this guy, don't say this. And what does he do? Yeah, he didn't learn his lesson. They said, well, did you know for let's say 1,500 years that nobody had ever been healed of leprosy that's mentioned in the Bible? Look at this. No leper had ever been healed, and so they never had to go through the cleansing recipe. Look at 2 Kings 5:1. Here we see Naaman. He's a captain of the army of the king of Syria. He was a great man with his master, honorable, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was also what? Okay, he wasn't Israeli. He's a Syrian. And now look at Luke chapter 4, verse 27 through 29, what Yeshua says. There were how many lepers? Many lepers in Israel in the time of Elijah the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed except two. Oh my gosh, they were all filled with wrath in the synagogue. I mean, think about this. Here Yeshua, he's trying to start his ministry, and the first thing he does is get everybody all upset. And they rose up and they threw him out of the city, and they led him to the brow of a hill that the city was built on, that they might throw him off a cliff. Now, what's fascinating, why in the world are there so many words in the Torah on cleansing a leper if it's rarely to never used? God doesn't, mince words. And look at how many times it says the priest shall examine, the priest shall examine, the priest shall examine. And then what happens? Nobody ever gets healed or cleansed of leprosy for over 1,000 years. So what is Yeshua saying? Well, the testimony that this gives to the religious leaders is that Messiah, the leper scholar, has finally arrived. That's what it's saying. Yeshua says, go tell them, because now they're going to realize they got to get out the recipe book. They don't know it. They got to go back, just like an old cake recipe. If you've never made it, you got to go grab the recipe book. Well, they had to go grab the Torah to find out, because never lepers had been cleansed. And so this is telling them that the leper scholar they've been talking about, the Messiah, is here. That was the purpose, was to let them know the Messiah's come. And in Matthew chapter 11, verse 4 and 5, Yeshua answers them when John, who's in prison, is wondering, are you the Messiah or do we look for another? He says, you go and tell Yochanan the things which you hear and see. What? The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, and the lepers are cleansed. The deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news preached to them. So he knew that the Messiah had come. His question is, are you the suffering servant Messiah, or are you the conquering king Messiah? Which one? Well, let's take another look again at the different ritual items that were necessary. You got to have 2 live clean birds, okay, cedar wood, scarlet wool, hyssop, and an earthen vessel filled with living water. I can't help but think of how humans are earthen vessels, and we're to be filled with living water. The important thing is one of the birds is killed over the living water. It creates the mixture of the water and the blood. The live bird is bound to the wood from a cedar tree with the scarlet thread and the hyssop, and then dipped into the blood of the living water mixture within the earthen vessel. How many know Yeshua was also an earthen vessel filled with living water? And then, of course, the leper sprinkled 7 times. The living bird is let go. Now, the cedar wood, I think, is incredible because it's known for its incorruptibility. And like the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we know Messiah was unleavened. We know he was incorruptible. The scarlet wool, guess where the scarlet wool came from? Where does wool come from? Sheep, a lamb. And it's a lamb with blood red wool, okay, representing the blood of the lamb. And the living water also is what carries the sins away. But with that said, let's take a look now at the Haftorah, what's connected to this Torah portion. So let's go to Ezekiel chapter 44 and look at verses 4 through 9. This is so significant. Here it is about the glory of God returning. Also, he brought me by way of the north gate to the front of the temple. I looked. Now remember, in Ezekiel 44, the temple's destroyed. Okay? He's in the Babylonian captivity. The temple's destroyed. And he says, the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord, and I fell on my face. So he's looking at the new temple. He's looking at the millennial temple. That's what this is about. And he says, and the Lord said to me, Son of man, mark well, see with your eyes, hear with your ears, all that I tell you concerning all the ordinances of the house of the Lord and all of its laws. Now, if you remember in Ezekiel, in the earlier chapters, the glory of God left. Okay? It was in the Holy of Holies, and it says it went over to the front of the holy areas, and then from there it went to the eastern gate. From there it went to where? The Mount of Olives. And the glory ascended to heaven from the Mount of Olives. And where did Yeshua ascend from? From the Mount of Olives. Okay? And now what happens? The glory of the Lord returns, and it comes to the Mount of Olives.
Thank you for joining with us. We hope you learned something new today. Please partner with us in fulfilling the scriptures about taking God's Torah to the nations. You can watch this whole program for free, along with all of our other archive programs right from our website link shown below. We hope to see you soon at our location right here in Tacoma, Washington. See you soon.